Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So for the past few videos, we've been tackling all sorts of things, mainly about fursuiting and furry conventions, which is great and all. I can never get enough of talking about those aspects of the furry fandom, but it's always nice to go back to the basics a little bit and explore some of the more fundamental aspects of being a furry. One of those furry fundamentals has to do with fursonas, those specialized anthropomorphic animal characters that many furries make to represent themselves in the fandom. And because they are designed to basically be someone's identity in this fandom, most furries really take their time to come up with one sona and use it across the entirety of the fandom. Though, that being said, there has been this relatively recent phenomenon happening with fursonas in this fandom, and it has to do with the idea that your fursona represents you and everything about you. Some people don't really subscribe to that idea and attempt to evolve the idea of a fursona into representing just something about them, not everything. And to fill in the gaps, those people may have 2 or 3 or even more anthro-animal representations that they also call fursonas. But does this work? Like, if furries start to splinter their fursonas to cover different things about them, do those separate entities still count as fursonas? It's an interesting question that I wanted to try and walk through today because, in all honesty, I see both sides of it. So let's get back to basics today and take a deeper look at the concept of a fursona, specifically whether a multitude of them can be used to refer to one person, or if it should remain as simple as one person, one fursona. In fact, let's start right there with the idea that a fursona should be a singular representation of yourself in this fandom. If you go around and ask people who have been in this fandom for a while, I'm talking over 10 years or so, they would probably associate the idea of a fursona being the singular representation that you use to, well, represent yourself in this fandom. This is why it should take a good amount of time to come up with the design and personality. It basically acts as how you want to be perceived by other members of this fandom. And because it's singular, anything about you currently or anything that you aspire to be should be added into that fursona, so it's as complete of an idea as possible. Now, this is a very, dare I say, traditional definition of a fursona. It's still taken seriously today, but back then it was a very serious endeavor. So much so, in fact, that a lot of the common topics of discourse in this fandom, including things like poodling, come from this idea that your fursona is you as an anthropomorphic animal in this fandom. And when you are in the context of furry, you are to use your fursona as your identity for everything. So it's not like this idea of being against things like poodling or even talking in fursuit if you have one came out of nowhere. They all come back to this idea that your fursona replaces your human persona when doing things in the furry fandom. And it kept this more pure idea that the magic of this fandom stems from all of us being our sonas, and anything that starts to bring the flawed human element of ourselves back into the mix starts to ruin that magic. In that same vein, the idea of having more than one fursona starts to fall apart for a lot of people who follow this more traditional idea of what a fursona represents. If your fursona is supposed to be you, having more than one dilutes the importance of representation of each of them and starts to split who you are as a furry into multiple entities. This is something that we can't do in real life. Well, kinda, we actually can, but I'll get to that in a second. But since we can't have multiple instances of ourselves in the real world, it doesn't make sense to do the same with fursonas. Now, a common counterpoint to this is that multiple fursonas are fine because they're just characters, and people have and buy and sell characters all the time. But then again, the more traditional definition of a fursona goes against this idea as well, as the thinking is that fursonas are more than just a character. They are too personal and too tied to us to be relegated to the same type of things that can be bought and sold and owned on a whim. So that's the central idea behind the argument against having multiple fursonas. The relationship that we should have with our sona should be very one-to-one. One person in this fandom, one fursona to use as their furry identity. But that's just one line of thinking, a line that many people don't subscribe to. In fact, they would argue the opposite, that having multiple fursonas is not just okay to do, but a natural part of being a furry. Much like the ideas of how to portray our furriness, this is a relatively more modern approach to the idea of designing and creating fursonas. It follows this more free-flowing approach to the fandom, where being a furry is what you make of it. There's no dress code, and how to act in a suit is totally up to you, since at the end of the day, it's your suit. It's your experience in the fandom, and it's your fursona. or fursonas. Now, to be fair, a majority of furries still have and work with just one fursona, but there is a growing number of people who are starting to add one or a couple more into their overall furry identity in this fandom. And there are many reasons for this, some of them being as simple as because they want to, which goes back to what we just talked about. But for many people in this fandom, the difference between a persona and a character really isn't more than just pure context. If you have a character that's primarily for the furry fandom, then you got yourself a persona. This idea is reinforced in a few ways in this fandom as well, mainly in the concept of character adoption. This can be seen not only in the adopts of characters that artists design for sale, but also with the proliferation of pre-made fursuits. What many people in this fandom do is buy a pre-made fursuit, build the character around parts of their personality, and add it as their main or side character as part of what they bring to the fandom as a whole. In this case, it's all about options. You don't have to tie yourself down to just one way to represent yourself as a furry. You can have multiple ways or multiple personas that all tie back to who you are as a furry in this fandom. So those are the two contrasting viewpoints on this idea, and honestly, to me, both have their merits. I think the more modern idea of a persona is very akin to how many furries are treating the fandom today, where it's more on how you want to experience and express your interest in anthropomorphic animals. So if I want to talk or show some skin while fursuiting, who cares? That's how I want to do things. But on the flip side, if you're only supposed to have one persona, then the importance of that one persona is super high. That persona is you in this fandom. So anything and everything you want to incorporate about who you are as a person requires very careful consideration when you're working with one true persona. Which leads us into the inevitable question about this topic. Which one is right? Well, I don't know. Why are you asking me? I'm not the commissioner or the emperor of the furry fandom. I don't run things around here. I'm just a purple kitty cat. But seriously, what's nice about this fandom is that there are few rules on how you want to express yourself in the fandom. In fact, I would argue the changes in behavior show how much this fandom has been growing, and who knows, maybe things will swing back to something more traditional in the next decade of furry. But if I had to answer, if you asked me how I would square this circle, here's how I would try to balance these two ideas. Now, this may be a surprise coming from me, but I actually agree that personas hold a high enough importance in this fandom that they should have some degree of separation over characters that could belong in basically any other context. However, I like to view personas as a true or ideological representation of our personalities. And since many of us have different personalities, I think it's fine to have multiple personas to match those personalities. I like to think about it this way because if we really want to get that specific, it's almost built into the word itself. One of the halves of the portmanteau of persona is persona. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that while we may be just one person, we have multiple personas. I mean, think about it. Think about how you present yourself as a whole and how that changes depending on who you're interacting with. For example, when I go to work, I bring my work persona, which is very proper and polite, and I like to circle back to things that were penciled in before so we can address the low-hanging fruit that was on the back burner that we talked about last offline. But that's a very different persona than what I bring when I see my parents, which is still very respectful, and I still don't talk back to them or say what instead of yes when they call to me. And that's very different from the persona that I bring to my non-furry friends, the barbershop, the airport, all of that. You see what I mean? So it's natural and almost expected of us to have different versions of ourselves depending on the situation. And the furry fandom is so vast and all-encompassing that in many ways it's not all that weird to have different personalities for the fandom as well. And to give identity and context to those different personas in the furry fandom, that naturally leads us to create personas and use them for different contexts in the fandom as well. Funnily enough, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but this idea reminds me of something that I absolutely hate doing: cooking. Think of us, the furries in the fandom, as a full meal. No, you're not just a snack, you're the whole meal. Now, a meal is one complete thing that we are presented with to eat, but to get there, multiple separate steps were involved that were necessary to complete that meal. If you break a complete meal apart, you may have the proteins, the vegetables, and starch that make up a bulk of what you're eating. Heck, you might even have a drink and a dessert to round things out as well. Each of those parts requires its own setup, materials, and time, all things that are different from the other parts of the meal. But they're not so separate that they can't be considered meals by themselves. They are all part of who you are, the meal of you. Hopefully this analogy analogy isn't falling apart too much. But that's how I see the different personalities that we have. They are all based on the same person, but different parts of us come out in different contexts to make up who we are. And this is something that we all do, whether we realize it or not. And it's so in tune with the human experience that it makes sense to have that also represented in the furry fandom as Fursonas. Now, of course, you don't have to work with this idea in this way. Truth be told, I have only one Fursona because how I am in the context of the furry fandom is very similar, no matter what part of the fandom I'm in. But that doesn't mean things will stay that way. In fact, in my free time, I've been, workshopping a couple of other Sonas to add to my repertoire. But even with all that being said, I don't want to seem like I'm picking and therefore defending a side in this intellectual conundrum. Honestly, I really respect the idea of having one Fursona tied to one person. I think it forces our Fursonas to take on a heightened importance that matches what makes them so special for so many of us in this fandom. However, I'm also not in the business of telling other people how to be furries, and if you want to have a different Fursona for every day of the week, power to you. But like most things, I think there's a sense of give and take that we can have when thinking about the idea of multiple Fursonas. If we tie them to our personalities, our personas, then having more than one makes sense, since how we present ourselves to different people in the real world changes with context as well. But that's just how I think of things, and you can take that as one of the many perspectives you have about what having a Fursona means and what it should represent for us furries in the fandom. But I want to hear from you. What do you think about Fursonas, and what does your Fursona or Fursonas mean or represent about you? It's funny, if you get to know me or get to talk to me in person for an extended period of time, these deep philosophical discussions about something as frivolous as a Fursona are like my bread and butter. Anyways, do let me know what you think about Fursonas in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll catch you in the next one. But until then, stay wild out there. Peace.